I want to think together for a few moments about this idea of redeeming humanism. When I think about redeeming humanism, I actually go back. I want to begin with an idea from a kind of a lesser-known inkling, Owen Barfield, and his book, History in English Words. It's in that book that Barfield makes a fascinating argument about language. He writes that, quote, "Language has preserved for us the inner living history of man's soul. It reveals the evolution of consciousness. Study of language," Barfield argues, "offers rewarding results. Quote, words may be made to disgorge the past that is bottled up inside them, as coal and wine, when we kindle or drink them, yield up their bottled sunshine." If Barfield is right, then we should expect to see major shifts in thought reflected in language. So, when trying to kind of get at the heart of humanism, and what exactly is humanism, I turn to the Oxford English Dictionary. It's one of my favorite resources, in part because it's a really strange dictionary. It does not claim to give you the definition of a word. Instead, it tracks the different ways people have used specific words at different points in time. So it's kind of doing what Barfield is talking about. It's the places you can see shifts in the way that people think. And it turns out, if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and you pull their definitions of humanism, humanity, and a humanist, there clearly is a bit of a bait and switch around the term humanism that starts in the early 20th century. So I want to just share some of those definitions. So bear with me. This is going to be, I just want to read some definitions for a moment, and then see if we can see this particular pattern. So for humanism, the third definition the OED gives is this: any system of thought or action which is concerned with merely human interest, as distinguished from divine, or with those of the human race in general, as distinguished from individual, the religion of humanity. That definition first appeared in 1860. Definition 4 reads, quote, devotion to those studies which promote human culture, literary culture, especially the system of the humanist, the study of the Roman and Greek classics, which came into vogue at the Renaissance. That definition appeared first in 1832. Now, those two are quite different than definition 5, which first appears in 1903. Here's definition 5. A pragmatic system of thought introduced by Schiller and William James, which emphasizes that man can only comprehend and investigate what is with the resources of the human mind, and discounts abstract theorizing. So, more generally implying that technological advance must be guided by awareness of widely understood human needs. By 1903, something seems to be shifting. Now, the same change appears when we look at the word humanist. In 1617, the OED records, a humanist was, quote, a student of human affairs or of human nature, formerly sometimes a secular writer, as distinguished from divine. Definition 2, one devoted to or versed in the literary studies called the humanities, a classical scholar, especially a Latinist, a professor or teacher of Latin. Do we have any Latinists in the room? All right, you're all very quiet. Do we have any Latinists in the room? Yes. There we go. Okay, come on, a little bit there. All right. So these Latinists are sometimes by early authors opposed to divine. That definition appeared first in 1589. Now, definition 3 pertains particularly to literary history. Quote, one of the scholars who at the revival of learning in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries devoted themselves to the study of the language, literature, and antiquities of Rome, and afterwards Greece, hence applied to later disciples of the same culture. That definition appears in 1670. Now again, quite a divide from definition 5, which pertains to philosophy. A humanist here is, quote, one whose beliefs are in accordance with Humanism 5, hearkening back to that 5th definition. Now, if we turn to humanity, we get a really interesting definition. Now, most of the definitions of humanity have to do with the human race, a certain application of kindness, and so on. For our purposes, definition 4 is quite interesting. Quote, learning or literature concerned with human culture, a term including the various branches of polite scholarship, as grammar, rhetoric, poetry, and especially the study of the ancient Greek and Roman classics. Humanity in this sense is part of the literae humaniores, the, quote, mental cultivation befitting a man, liberal education, as used by Aulus Gellius, Cicero, and others, hence taken as literary culture, polite literature. But it was very often in scholastic and academic use opposed to divinity, that is, secular learning. Now, that definition first appeared in English in 1483 in William Caxton's translation of the Golden Legend. For example, he flowered in double science, that is to say, divinity and humanity. Now, in 1893, you see a similar kind of usage. Quote, the first professor of humanity in CCC Oxford was Ludovicus Vives, the celebrated Spanish humanist. Now, as these definitions reveal, there was a nearly universal understanding across multiple cultures and across centuries of humanism tied to secular study. Such a secularity, however, also does not mean what it usually means today. Secular, across the High Middle Ages and into the 19th century, drew a distinction between those called to the clergy and everyone else. Secular did not mean opposed to God, but rather those called to a particular kind of human life: marriage, family, and work outside the church hierarchy. Such a humanism existed under the reign of Queen theology. Beginning in the early 20th century, more and more people began articulating humanism differently, in opposition to traditional morality, revealed religion, and the Western tradition of thought in general. Now, the easiest place to see this new definition of humanism is in the three humanist manifestos put forth by the American Humanist Association in 1933, 1973, and 2003. These manifestos make clear the divergence between traditional thought, grounded in the revelation of Christianity and the Western tradition, and the modernistic, science-driven view. So permit me to read a few excerpts from each. So the Humanist Manifesto of 1933, Manifesto 1, says this, quote, first, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Second, humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as the result of a continuous process. Third, holding an organic view of life, humanists find that the traditional dualism of mind and body must be rejected. Sixth, we are convinced that the time has passed for theism, deism, modernism, and the several varieties of new thought. Again, written in 1933. Now, by 1973, the American Humanist Association updated their manifesto to say this: we find insufficient evidence for the existence of a supernatural. It is either meaningless or irrelevant to the question of survival and fulfillment of the human race. As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. Further, they write, while there is much that we do not know, humans are responsible for what we are and will become. No deity will save us. We must save ourselves. The most recent of these manifestos adds this, as sort of a culmination. Quote, and we're now from the year 2003. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. Humanists ground values in human welfare, shaped by human circumstances, interests, and concerns, and extended to the global ecosystem and beyond. We are committed to treating each other as having inherent worth and dignity, and to making informed choices in a context of freedom, consonant with responsibility. They conclude with this line, we aspire to this vision with informed conviction that humanity has the ability to progress towards its highest ideals. The responsibility for our lives and the kind of world in which we live is ours, and ours alone. The secular humanist vision, here presented by these manifestos, is one of brave individuals facing the nihilism of a meaningless world, tasking themselves with defining meaning and creating the world they long to live in. Such a humanism, I contend, is both worthless and impossible. Humanists of this vein cannot actually live in the way they imagine. And their very project is in that sense doomed from the start. The authors of the three humanist manifestos reflect a reality C.S. Lewis noted in The Abolition of Man. Quote, an open mind in questions that are not ultimate is useful, but an open mind about the ultimate foundations, either of theoretical or practical reason, is idiocy. If a man's mind is open on these things, let his mouth at least be shut. He can say nothing to the purpose. Secular humanists reject the necessary foundations for human flourishing in the quest for an open mind, and in so doing, they lose the ability to rightly understand the human person. So, why does all this matter? Well, at stake in the word humanism are really two opposed views of reality. On the secular humanism side, we construct reality and meaning because humans are the only beings with rational capacities. In such a view, nature is ours to master, manipulate, and make in our image. The transhumanist vision of the future, with uploadable consciousnesses into robot bodies, is only possible in a world of secular humanism, where the human mind is the highest consciousness. But on the other hand, there is the traditional recognition of the glory of man made a little lower than the angels. The Christian humanist begins with creation, and that fact of creation obligates us to the Creator. The secular humanist sees creation as a limit, a constraint on his freedom. He's wrong. The reality of our experience as human beings is that within relationship, within hierarchy, we live and move and have our being. The Christian humanist celebrates all that it means to be human, and he sees in our nature a right submission to that which is higher. Now, perhaps no one has worded the glory of being human as well as C.S. Lewis in his sermon, The Weight of Glory. I'm going to read a slightly extensive passage that Lewis gives at the end of that sermon. It may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all love, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals we joke with, work with, marry, snub, exploit. Immortal horrors, everlasting splendors. Now this, Lewis suggests, is really what all of us are. And this is what humanism, rightly understood, is all about studying everything that it means to be human. Now, some years ago, I began, when people asked me what I enjoyed teaching, why I taught, I usually worked the phrase Christian humanist in somewhere. I learned such language from professors at Hillsdale College and from my favorite podcasters. They were the host of the Christian Humanist Radio Network. Now, invariably, I would get responses of shock. Humanist? You don't love God? You're an atheist? That's usually how people would respond. And often this was in a church setting. And those kind of responses have left me convinced that the real meaning, the original meaning of humanism has been captured. Now, there are scholars like Jen Zimmerman and his book, Incarnational Humanism, A Philosophy of Culture for the Church, and Carl Trueman with his most recent First Things lecture on a new humanism, who are working to sort of recover that language. Then all the same, from a different angle, you've got theologians like J.I. Packer and his book, Christianity, the True Humanism, that's trying to redeem the term. Now, I think that we here at this conference can contribute to an ongoing conversation about this term. I think it actually matters that we reclaim humanism, because humanism as an idea ties directly to what it means to be human, how we live well, and what exactly we all think is possible in education. The humanities are the subjects dedicated to studying all that it means to be human. The Christian humanist begins where Solomon began. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the holy is understanding. The Christian humanist begins with the study of man as a discrete being who exists contingent first on other humans who made him, and then on a created cosmos that pre-exists him. The Christian humanist approaches the task of study not with the goal of creating reality, but of receiving it and stewarding it. Christian humanism recognizes that the law of the Lord, the natural law written into the very fabric of reality, is no constraint forced upon the weak by the powerful, but a light making clear his way. It is a lamp unto my feet, a light for my path. By this law, one learns how he ought to live. The clarity of knowing what one is, of perceiving the purpose for which one exists, enables the lifelong pursuit of virtue, Arte, excellence. So, humanism is a term worth fighting for. It's worth thinking about. And I'm grateful for friends new and old who have gathered to help us all in that contemplation. So let me introduce you to our panel. It was a very long-winded introduction, but I want to introduce you to our panel, then we'll get some food because food has appeared. We're going to start on the far end of our panel. Dr. Matthew Crawford is a philosopher, most well known for his book, Shop Class as Soulcraft. He is deeply concerned with the nature of work and with getting to the heart of things. Wisdom is the common pursuit of philosophers. Dr. Crawford will help us see in Christian humanism a wisdom sufficient to solve contemporary problems. Seated next to him is his wife, Dr. Marilyn Simon. I've read Dr. Simon's Shakespeare criticism for years. She is a delightful student of the Bard, and she brings her insights into the mundane world with wit and verve. Shakespeare was perhaps the greatest student of human nature. His plays invite us to inhabit a thoroughly human world and to see in the action mirrors of possibility. Dr. Simon will help us appreciate our humanity all the more. Next, Dr. James Hankins is professor of history at Harvard University, focusing on Renaissance statesmanship. We met last November huddling over a heating unit at the ISI headquarters in Delaware. It was very cold in that tent. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Hankins for maintaining a reality-based scholarship in the midst of a university that is fighting the very tradition that it inherited. History looks to human nature not in some idyllic sense, but in all of its messiness and actual complexity. Dr. Hankins will take us back to the Renaissance and enable us to go ad fontes, to the sources, in our search for a true humanism. Dr. Scott Postma is CEO of Kepler Education. He's a student of literature with a deep interest in Flannery O'Connor and the grotesque. Scott will help us see a nationwide movement of classical Christian educators who are keeping the tradition of Christian humanism alive. Higher education has, for the most part, forgotten why the humanities matter. Classical education is the place where the humanities are thriving. So, it's going to be a wonderful evening and a day. I suspect we will have a great time together. And with that, we are going to take a 15-minute break. And before everybody's released, we have first dibs to our panelists because they have to come back and talk for the next hour. So panelists, this is your moment. And you have about, once you've gotten there, I will tell everybody else they can go get food. But panelists, go grab some food. Scott has the mic for the panelists. So if you want to answer a question, just get the mic. We'll share that back and forth, hopefully. My goal for each of these questions, some of them may pertain more to one academic discipline than others, but please feel free to speak to it if you want to speak to it and to respond to what other folks have said. Our goal really is to make this as conversational as possible. So I'd like to start off with this question. The medieval university, famously called theology the queen of the sciences, do the humanities need to be ruled? Or are they sufficient alone? Is perhaps one of the humanities a ruling discipline? I have in mind there Sir Philip Sidney's essay, Defense of Poesy. He argues that literature is actually the best, which perhaps has something to do with him loving literature. But he argues that philosophy and history might be contenders, but literature is definitely the best. Is one, in fact, the ruler, or do they all need to submit to some other discipline?
Well, you said intelligent people, so I was going to pass the mic down to this end of the panel. But I would just answer in very short that theology has to be the queen of the sciences, or else if we don't have transcendence, then man becomes the measure of all things. Then everything simply becomes a social construct, or it becomes relative. In terms of what rules, in the humanities, perhaps Sidney's answer following Horace is what does he say? Utile et dulce. That by delighting and teaching, we have some sense, what Aristotle said, of what humans are capable of doing. Rather than history that says here's what people have done. We have a philosophical, approach. So in some sense, that would be my very short answer.
Well, I'm an historian, so I always think of this in historical terms. So when the humanities were invented in the 14th century, by the way, not before. They're not the same as the liberal arts, and I'll explain why that's the case tomorrow. They occupied a particular place between mechanical arts and university arts. The university arts at that time were perceived to be pre-professional. Theology, very few people studied theology at universities. They mostly studied law. A smaller number studied medicine, and a very tiny number studied theology. So the medieval university is really perceived at the time as a pre-professional education. And the humanities was perceived as gentlemanly education. It was gentlemanly education, but they had to justify the creation of more humane human beings. That's what literae humanioras do, right? They make us more humane. So these are studies that are designed to make us more human. They justify this by appealing to the Thomistic distinction between the natural and supernatural end of man. So religion has the role of orienting us to the next life and making us worthy to stand in the presence of God, whereas the humanities were more oriented to this life, to the human end of mankind. So that, yes, the humanities do need to be guided by theology or by wisdom, I would say. And it was recognized at the time because we're all teachers here, right? We all teach, and we try to make our students better. And in classical schools, we try to make them better, not only intellectually, but also in terms of character. However, that can be a theological problem. Some people saw this as Pelagianism, right? The belief that human beings in their own power could make human beings better. So I think it's important to have a theological perspective, to have the kind of perspective that people had in the Renaissance, that human nature was and human destiny and the end of mankind in this life is not the only aspect of human nature. And when we aim to make people more human, we can't let that trump the need that everyone has to orient themselves to the divine. So I think there is a theological question there. It needs to be addressed. But when you don't have that sort of perspective, then you get transhumanism, right? That's what happens when you continue to try to become more and more powerful, more and more effective as a human being. You need to have the limits of nature that are established by wisdom and by philosophy and theology.
I guess I want to first, there's a little bit of fuzz here, just register what maybe many of us are thinking, which is Josh's mini lecture there was a kind of a tour de force and a real education, for me at least, in sort of the arc of humanism. This question, so I have to say I'm a sort of a newcomer to this whole preoccupation with humanism and Christian humanism in particular. So this question is theology, should it be regarded as the queen of the sciences? I remember in graduate school hearing at some point that political science was the queen of the sciences. These are a bunch of Straussians. Maybe they picked it up from Aristotle or something. I don't know. So I like this formulation of the sort of central or founding or grounding role for theology. So the sciences, or the humanities, is just sort of inquiry in general, let's say. Why do we do it? I think we do it because we're attracted to truth. There's something beautiful about truth there's an erotic quality to philosophy. Let's just use philosophy as sort of standing in for the sciences and humanities. So in the Platonic sense of erotic, so there's some sort of intimation that we have, I think, naturally, that what is true is somehow good also, which raises the question, in virtue of what are these good things good? And again, the sort of Platonic answer would be, it's by virtue of their participation in the good. So already with that step, I think you're at least halfway toward God. In other words, I think the only way that the intellectual life is sustained is by some, at least inchoate sense that there is an objective order of good that is given. In other words, it's not simply a projection of our minds, a kind of subjective projection. This raises the question, if it's given, it raises the question of a giver. So the question of a benevolent creator of the order that is given. And that is the business of theology, to inquire into this. So it seems like theology then does have a kind of grounding role in that it's inquiring into the conditions for the possibility of inquiry or philosophy altogether. So, yes.
I think I'm going to try to bridge something that you said in your talk and then just said now. So I think it was the humanists of the 70s, you said that they have to look bravely into the face of nihilism and for human flourishing, with human actualization. Well, why should they be brave? Why is that seen as inherently good rather than cowardly or just self-serving? So secular humanism always has a trap set for itself. If it has any kind of values that bravery is somehow better than cowardice. So yes, again, theology should be the crown for the queen. Just last night, I was with a group of friends out at a Canadian lake, very beautiful. And one of the guys brought out a guitar, which is very lake vibe. And he started singing Bob Dylan's You Gotta Serve Someone. Might be the devil, might be the Lord, but you gotta serve someone. So I have that in the back of my head, just listening to that question. So yeah, you gotta serve someone. And even if it is just a projection, let's just say it is, it's more beautiful if you serve something good. Like it's just a better story. So yeah, I'm all in.
I think there's a reason the question has been around for at least 1,000 years. I mean, but at the same time, I just think it's worth noting that the five of us up here, I think, would all call ourselves some version of humanist in one way or another, and yet none of us are theologians. So we're attempting to appreciate the role that theology plays without inherently being drawn to the theological mode of thought and scholarship as a career path. So let me ask a different question from kind of a different angle. So what is your favorite Shakespeare play and why? Lest we all become scholastics up here.
The last one I've read. But I think actually I'd like to connect this with the previous question because I think Matthew was suggesting that we're looking at the humanities as a window onto the divine, where bright shoots of everlastingness piercing through this earthly dress. But isn't there a place also just for the merely human? for just, wit and charm and the beauty of good manners and everyday life? Does everything have to be related to the divine? Or is there a realm of the human which is nothing that's independent of the divine, obviously, but is there a place for playfulness and for comedy in Shakespeare? Maybe my favorite plays are comedies. I don't know. Anyway, you're the Shakespearean, and you should answer the Shakespeare question.
Well, sure. I can, unless you wanted to respond. Okay. I think it's a dead tie for me between Taming of the Shrew, which I see as Shakespeare's most unambiguously cheerful play. And I'm an outlier, but I think Kate and Petruchio are sexy and fun and
I did.
I think they're very happy. The other one is a little known play called Cymbeline, or some people call it Cymbeline. And for me, during my dissertation, it was the ground zero of my fork in the road as, a doctoral student at a secular university steeped in secular humanism, which in some ways is very intellectually compelling. But Cymbeline spoke to me through 400 years, and it was decisive in turning me toward Christianity. So if you don't know it, it tends toward tragedy. You're reading it and it feels like this is going to be a catastrophe. And then, lots of stuff happens. It's a massive play. It's epic. But Juno literally descends from the heavens. So God descends. And of course, Shakespeare in Elizabethan England couldn't, or actually that was under King James, but anyways, he couldn't show God or anything sort of divine on the stage. That would have been profane. But Juno is pretty close. And so there's this direct intervention of a God in the history of us mortals. And then immediately, every grudge, every harm, every wound turns toward redemption and good. And it is just like a series of moments of forgiveness, moments of mercy, moments of transformation. And at one point, everybody's guilty. That's the thing too. They're all very guilty, but they all get forgiven by each other. And one character says, my mercy over you, or my power over you, is to forgive you. And then it's responded by saying, pardon's the word to all. And then a soothsayer, this happens in sort of ancient Britain, if you don't know the play, a soothsayer says, the fingers of the powers above do tune the harmony of this peace. So the interesting thing about Cymbeline is that it happened at a sort of mythical time in Britain's history that was at the same time as Bethlehem, as the Nativity of Christ. So that off stage, there's this bright sort of center of gravity that moves onto Shakespeare's play of redemption and transformation, and very much this worldly, it is a very political play. So anyways, these are just personal ones for me. Cymbeline was transformative, and Taming of the Shrew is sexy. So those are the reasons.
I also, I'd have to pick Taming of the Shrew. I read it as a sort of practical guide to marriage. Lots of useful advice in there.
It is the moon.
I almost agree with James. It's like whatever the last Shakespeare, what last thing you read is so wonderful. But I think King Lear captures something in the tragedy of abdication that I don't know. Maybe it's personal in that different stages of your life, you see different things. But there's a lot there to unpack. But I think King Lear in the abdication, there's a great tragedy there that happens, and yet a kind of redemption that with Edward, raising up as the next king, even through it, is almost a kind of a Christ-like figure in that. I know some say that Cordelia is a Christ figure there, but I think it's Edward. So anyway, that's a thought.
Well, if anybody wants to hear more about the Christ figures in King Lear, I'm sure they'll come find you, Scott, and want you to justify that. I did not know there were going to be so many fans of Taming of the Shrew on this panel. I might have asked some more specific questions. I love that play, but it is a continually divisive play. I have yet to teach it without suddenly discovering feminists in my classroom that I had no idea were there. But Taming of the Shrew just draws them all out. Okay, I want to ask a different question because when we go back to the Renaissance, there's this I think inextricable connection between the study of really Greek and Latin and to some extent Hebrew and sort of the recovery of this appreciation of the Greco-Roman world. And we live in a day today where there certainly are academic disciplines that stress the acquisition of language. And yet there are more works in translation today than there have ever been before. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of two parts of a question, I suppose. First, does humanism depend on language acquisition? And possibly a variation of that, is there something that those who are working only in translation miss, that those who are working in the primary language really can get?
I'm going to answer quickly just because I already have the mic in my hand, but I would say as someone who is not completely proficient in language acquisition, I have some Greek proficiency and a little bit of Latin proficiency, there are limitations that you become very acutely aware of. So for the serious scholar in certain aspects of humanities, I think you are absolutely limited, just outright you are. Although I do think with some of the great scholarship that has the Tati Renaissance Library and some of these that have been translated for us, there's still a lot left. Even some of the Erasmus work still being done. There's still it's not accessible, but I think there's a lot there that, let's call it an amateur, could get at. So I think it would be kind of gradations would be my simple opinion.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think everybody should learn Latin. Okay, I'm just going to say it. But, and I've been editing, as Scott mentioned, a translation series for the last 25 years, and we've just published our 100th volume of bilingual texts, Latin on one side, English on the other side. However, the reason I say this is it's part of becoming more human. It doesn't have to be Latin. It could be Sanskrit. It could be some other language. But in fact, humanists are trying to become more human. And part of that is learning to communicate at a very high level with other human beings. I spend a lot of time with people who are not native speakers of English. And some of them speak extremely well, very few. But what they lack often is the subjunctive and the optative and the subtleties of English speech, and they lose a lot. This is, in fact, one of the main reasons why the humanities got started in the 14th century, because Petrarch and other humanists felt that Latin had become flat and featureless, and it was professionalized. It was no one knew how to express the person. They didn't have poetry. They had lost the ability to communicate at a very high level. So one thing that happens when you study Latin or any language seriously, but especially dead languages, is that you translate. And you sit around the table, that's what I did in my classics education, and you try to find the best language in English to translate beautiful poetry, beautiful prose in another language. And it gives you an appreciation for the subtlety and the beauty and power of language that you can't get really in any other way. And I think that this is something that humanists should glory in. It should be something that we offer the world, that we teach people to communicate at a very high level, and not just, using a translation app, but where you can form deep connections with other people and the study of past texts that you can't in any other way. I just got back from China. I spent 30 days in China, and everyone there has the translation app, right, on their phone. And I go into the store, and if I can't make myself understood in Chinese, which is most of the time, I put out the translation app, and then, or someone wants to communicate with me, they get out the translation app. But tell me, you're not going to make a friend that way, right? You can't make a friendship that. A friendship requires communication, a deeper communication. And I think this is what humanists should say, that this is what we do. We help people to communicate across cultures, across time, at a very high level, in ways that they don't do in any other field. You can do this engineering does not teach you how to commute with the soul of another person. I'm sorry, maybe for engineers it works, but I think that this is something, and I believe that Latin is an excellent way to do this, just because it is a dead language, but there's also a huge tradition of translation and commentary on all the major classical texts that you can use as a resource to get really deep into beautiful prose and poetry and understand how it works.
So I don't know Latin, but I did teach Latin in high school. But I did fall in love with Greek. So I was a physics major, and so okay, let me back up even further. In college, but in middle school, I went to a middle school called Malcolm X, which will give you some sense of what the priorities were. So I didn't learn grammar. I mean, I didn't have the first idea. I didn't know what a particle or a participle or a preposition. I didn't know what. I had never even heard these terms practically. So I was, I got into reading Plato early in graduate school, and I wanted to read him in Greek. I guess, you'd learn a few words, right? And you can look in the lexicon once you've learned the alphabet. And what was so arresting is the sheer alienness of ancient thought once you begin to go into the language. And I think just that fact of like this, you're entering a different world here. And that's a kind of liberating moment, right? So my first attempt at learning Greek was at the intensive summer Greek program at Berkeley, which is 8 hours a day in the classroom and maybe another 4 hours of homework. It is intense. And me not knowing what a preposition is coming into this. So I lasted a few weeks and dropped out. So I did first year Greek 3 times. The second time was in night school while working, like 2 or 3 jobs. Finally it took, and then I went on from there. Yeah, I mean, it's that introduction to a genuinely other world of thought that I think I mean, this is just, it's trite to say so, but it gives you a critical distance on your own time and its certainties that is truly liberating. I mean, the liberal education at the root of that, right, is liberal, a kind of liberation, I think. Again, from the certainties of the present.
I'm just a mere Shakespearean, so I don't know any ancient languages. I think it might have been Jung who said, if you can't find God, you're not looking low enough, or something like that. I'm not sure who said that. So I'm going to bring it down to the people. When I read Shakespeare, though, for instance, and this has to do with like this sort of different idea, like a genuinely foreign time. It isn't Hamlet that I find hard, it's the low-class characters that are very hard to understand because they're like talking street. They're talking like a Gen Z talks with all their lingo. So, I mean, imagine somebody coming 400 years from now. How would you tell, I'm going to bring it low, how would you tell just by reading a text the difference between a butt dial and a booty call? Because like this would be perplexing. So it's true. Think about it. So I don't know if I have a point here. It's just, you guys got me thinking about the ancient ways of Elizabethan sort of gutter talk. But it is different, and that's where the students stumble too, actually. So can we ever fully access then the nuances? Like the notes help and everything, but even how much are we actually getting to the tone and the sort of innuendo of these things? Like language, and I actually love the way Gen Z plays with language. I think this is one of their great forms of sort of fun and creativity and playfulness. I find it compelling, although my teenage kids hate it if I say things like Riz or Aura. It's fun. But anyways, I don't know if I don't know. I should probably have learned Latin. Yes. Yes.
Well, like one thing I love about Marilyn is that the bard, you always keep it earthy, and Professor Hankins, recalled us to the, I think, important idea that the humanities can be this kind of but the human is the real category here that I think we're interested in, and so the earthy is indispensable, I think, for wrapping our heads around the human condition, and let's not be too professorial over the next day.
Yeah, that's the playfulness, the wit.
Maybe I'll just add one thought there, that it makes a huge difference. I mean, becoming more human is learning to think and speak at a higher level. And when you study really great users of language, it doesn't have to be Latin. I will admit it. It might be, it might be English. Shocking as that may hear, but you study really good users of language, and you discover that there is such a thing as inevitability. That was one of the canons of great speeches, is that, and my teachers used to do this with me when I was in high school, is you have to, okay, here's several sentences from, I think, who did she like? You can use C.S. Lewis, okay? Use C.S. Lewis. So everyone agrees is a beautiful user of language. Now try to write the same thought in other language, or try to write on a similar topic in the style of C.S. Lewis. And you pretty soon find out that you have a certain way to go before you can write that way, because you learn what good language use is, and this is something that makes us more human. The excellent use of language, and again, it's something I think that the humanities really deserve, to make a banner of our enterprise. I may have just turned that off. So.
Well, we seem to have kind of already hit on another question I wanted to go to, with centering around the human. And certainly speech and language is a huge part of what it means to be human. But I'd love to hear any or all of your thoughts on this question. What elements of human nature are universal and essential? And then secondly, how does your discipline help students perceive those elements of their nature? I suppose I'm asking, in what way do practicing the humanities, in what way do they make us more human?
I guess there's a lot of ways that we could go on this question, but so you said universal, what was the other? Universal and essential?
Those might be the same thing.
Okay, but something that's, I guess I'm thinking through my thoughts here, whether I'm playing off of, the idea of, Matt had mentioned Eros earlier in the Platonic sense, but I think this idea of a desire, it could be curiosity, it could be wonder, it could be Aristotle's, all men desire to know. There is that sort of human desire, that human desire to know in a sort of transcendent way. And I'm not even actually talking about God necessarily at this point, but I'm just talking about that idea of wanting to reach out beyond ourselves, or wanting to know. And I think that's a pretty universal and essential human desire. It's what causes us to grow. It's what causes us to find a mate for life. It's what causes us to get an education. It's what causes us to build buildings. It's what causes us to seek just about every human enterprise. And so I think there's a sense in which that's essential. And so the way that literature, poetry, moral philosophy, any of these, history, compels us to understand the other, to the otherness, the human desire, in a different kind of form, helps us relate in some ways to what it looks like in our own contemporary sense. Does that make sense? So that touching something from another time period, or somebody else's idea about something, whether you're reading Plato or Heidegger, this idea of knowing more or understanding our humanness, or who we are in this contemporary sense, I think is universal, and I think it's essential. So how do we keep promoting that in our students, cultivating that in our students, to wonder, to know, to desire? And I think literature, probably poetry, in many ways does that thing the best. I don't know, I kind of felt like Michael Scott there for a moment, starting to answer and hoping that I would get to something, but.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about history. I'm a historian. And I think the desire to remember is universal, and especially the desire to remember great things that have happened and great disasters that have happened. The West has always been interested in history since Herodotus, and Imperial China has always had historians. And the function of history was originally, I think, to increase practical wisdom. It's actually quite explicit in the ancient historians that the reason we are writing this stuff down is because we want to remember great men. We also want to remember great mistakes that great men have made, and that we need to understand how things have gotten from good to bad and from bad to good. Okay? That's what history is supposed to teach. So Cicero says somewhere that the man who knows no history remains forever a child. And what he means by that is that just as we revere, or we used to revere anyway, older men, older women, because they had experience of life that we can learn from, you can greatly extend your natural memory. If you could greatly extend your natural memory for hundreds and thousands of years, you would have an accumulation of wisdom. So this is what history actually did until the 19th century when Hegel upset the apple cart. And I think it's still something that human beings want to do, that they want to remember their past, and they want to remember things that have been important to them. I was thinking in this regard of in Book 1 of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which is wonderful text, but it's just Marcus Aurelius remembering virtuous people, people that he had grown up with, and people who changed his life, and people who modeled for him what a virtuous person was. Because, frankly, virtue is rather rare, and we don't have too many experiences of that in our own life. I'm fortunate that I've had knowledge of a number of virtuous people. If you've ever met someone who's really holy, for example, really has real sanctity, it changes your life, okay? So this is, I think, why we need history, to remember and to extend our memories and to understand what virtue is in the concrete. This is what I loved with Marcus Aurelius. He went through all of his early influences, his teacher, his parents, his uncles, and he describes what they were like. So if instead of having this abstract discussion of what virtue is in Aristotle's Ethics, wonderful as that is, to have living examples of people who have behaved well and have struggled to do what's right in the worst of circumstances, that is incredibly valuable. And I think that's universal. That's something that all societies try to do in one way or another.
What's the question again? Is it something essential to?
Just if I can summarize that. How does your discipline help students perceive the universal elements of their nature?
Universal elements of their nature. So, well, what would be universal? The body, and that it has a limit, and that it's finite, that we self-narrate in order to understand ourselves, but also, I think, to be understood by others, because I think at ground is a universal need to be loved and love. So somebody close to me has an intellectual disability, and in watching how her physical self forms how she narrates herself in expressing her love and also showing how she wants to be loved. I'm like, even aside from higher education, this is the human in a very beautiful way. So yeah, I always take it right down back to the body. But yeah.
Just to pick up on what Marilyn just said, so George Will has a son with Down syndrome, and he said of his son, he's just like everyone, he's just like the rest of us, only more so. And I love that. I'm going to use that in my talk tomorrow, but somehow speaks to the human condition. Okay, I was going to say a couple of things, if I can remember them. So, yeah, I think the value of history Without acquaintance with history, you're unacquainted with the peaks, right, of the peaks of human excellence. So you're then doomed to a kind of self-satisfied being trapped in the present and in mediocrity, I think, necessarily. Or at least, I mean, there are natural geniuses that shine forth in every age, but in terms of sort of having access to a standard for kind of assessing and gaining some acquaintance with a rank hierarchy of the human history is really indispensable. As far as disciplines, so Charles Taylor has this book called The Language Animal. Is that the title? The Language Animal? Yeah, I think that's it. Something like that. He makes the case for the use of language as really core to being human, and the idea is that we articulate ourselves in the course of living, and the activity of doing that is actually constitutive of being human, that it's a kind of interpretive, unlike an animal that just exists in the present, human beings interpret their existence, and they do so with language. Anyway, so there's a case for language as being really at the core. Just this past week, in the journal First Things, I made an argument for mathematics as being a really core human activity. I think the experience of doing math, and in particular sort of mathematical physics, kind of alerts one to cosmos. So cosmos is order. It also has connotations of beauty a little bit, as in our word cosmetic, right? So it's an order that's given. I think in doing mathematical physics, you can't help but run up against the idea of an order that is given in good. And the reason the goodness comes through in the beauty of math. When you apprehend something fundamental, for me, the sort of most shining moment of my education as a physics major came in this final lecture in this seminar on electricity and magnetism, where early in the semester we'd learn Maxwell's equations, which describe the fundamental unity of magnetism and electricity. So, you can do the problem sets, you learn it. But towards the end of the course, the professor, he took us backward to the wave equation, which describes all phenomena that have periodic motion, so water waves, in the ocean, for example. And he began from that, and then without telling where we were headed, where we were going, it's like sort of mystifying, where are we going with all this? Is in the final minute of the final class, there was Maxwell's equations on the blackboard, and it was a revelation of something of incomparable beauty, completely different from learning them, early in the course as something to be just accepted. It was now something revealed.
We are quickly coming to the time we're going to turn it over to audience questions. That brings us to our last question for the panel, and that's a directed question to Dr. Hankins. because in just a few moments, Maria File is going to tell us who is going to win this beautiful copy of The Golden Thread. But before we get there, Dr. Hankins, could you tell us a little bit about this book, and why does the world need a new history of the Western tradition?
Well, first of all,
Wait, you need the microphone.
yeah. Yeah, first of all, it should come with a health warning that carrying it around could be dangerous to your back. You could have back injury. This book was written for the classical education movement. So I first encountered it, that is the classical education movement, about 7 or 8 years ago. And having taught at Harvard for 40 years, my impression of the general direction of American education was down, 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 down. And the classical education movement was the first thing that actually gave me hope that we could do something better in this country than what we were already, than just circling the drain. So I never thought in my life that I would be writing a Western civ book. Well, it's not really a Western civ book, it's about the Western tradition. There's a difference. But because I've been sort of hardcore scholar since the beginning, I edit texts and I do textual studies. But at a certain point, I decided that it was time to make use of my tenured status at the university that thinks it's the greatest university in the world, but probably is not, and to do something. So I wrote this book. It took about 5 years. I wrote it with my old buddy Alan Gelzo. He's doing volume 2. I did volume 1. So Alan Gelzo is my oldest friend in academia. We went to middle school and high school together. And we're going to go to the Hamilton School of the University of Florida next year. We're going to retire together. So Encounter Books approached us about doing this monster. And it was going to take us a year, we thought, and would be 1 volume, but it's become gigantic. But I think that it is absolutely necessary to have a new history of the Western tradition, just because we're losing it. It hasn't been taught. When I was younger, when I first came into the profession in the 1980s, it was Western Civ was a required course. And it was required in maybe the majority of states by social studies requirements, statewide social studies requirements. Many colleges had it. We had it at Harvard, believe it or not. We had a Western Civ requirement in the 1990s. But that all disappeared. It all disappeared, and no one has been taught the Western tradition. It was replaced by global history. And global history is, to my mind, a fiction. What you lose with global history is you can't tell a story of any civilization, a longitudinal story of any civilization, because what happens is you do the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians, and then you just, excuse my language, it's one damn thing after another, but they're not connected by any narrative thread. And I have 3 nephews who teach in public schools, and one of them teaches global history, and it's fragmented. You don't get a sense of any history. You don't even get a comparative sense, which would actually be useful, because they're so busy trying to avoid condemning anybody, and making comparisons causes too much political trouble. So it's very distracting. But we need to understand the narrative of our story as a civilization. And one thing we especially need to know now is how fragile it is. Very few people understand how fragile a civilization is. And the history of the Western tradition is not the history of a civilization. It's the history of at least 4 civilizations that are bound together by the thread of tradition. And that thread has almost snapped many times in the Western past, and we're in danger of losing it now. just give you a couple examples that are absolutely startling when you first understand them. The Aristotelian tradition, all right? When Aristotle died, his books went to Theophrastus, and Theophrastus died, the books went to some relative, and they were put in the basement of, in someone's basement for 3 centuries. The Aristotelians who lectured after Aristotle did not know the works of Aristotle. They were in that tradition. And they were finally rediscovered in the 1st century BC, after they were brought to Rome. But they were down to a single box of manuscripts. So the educational tradition of the West is built on study of Aristotle from the 12th century to the 17th century. All that would have been gone if that somebody had burned that box of books, okay? The Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian's Code has a text in it which is called the Pandects. That's one of its names. So the Corpus Juris is a collection of laws and treatises on basic education, but it has one book in it, the Pandects, which collects the jurisprudence of the Romans, meaning the cases of Roman, famous cases in Roman history that were solved by famous jurists. In other words, this is the book which teaches you how Romans reasoned about law. It's the only book that survives, that teaches us jurisprudence, how the Romans thought through law problems. That too was down to one manuscript in the 11th century. And then somebody got hold of it. It was in Pisa. No, it was in, it was in southern Italy, then it came to Pisa. It's now in Florence. We almost lost the entire Western legal tradition because it was down to one manuscript. And there are many texts that are like this. Catullus survives in one manuscript. Plato in the 14th century was down to 3 manuscripts. Complete Plato was down to 3 manuscripts. And you can go on, but there's a few devoted people around who kept the tradition alive, like Petrarch and many monks in monasteries copying books. They kept the tradition alive in bad times. But those texts were the basis of rebirth in our civilization at various times. When the Roman legal tradition was recovered in the 12th century, it was the basis of the 12th century Renaissance. And when the humanities were recovered and the humanists in the West learned to read Greek in the 14th and 15th centuries, we had a cultural effervescence like never before. And that's what we need now. We need to have a Renaissance. And we need to recover those texts. The physical survival of ancient texts has not been in doubt since the invention of printing. But it's not enough to have physical copies everywhere. And the first printers were very aware. Aldus Manutius, who was a great printer of Latin, was very aware that he's a great printer first printer of Greek texts. He published the Editiones Principes of many Greek texts. He was very aware that he was preserving Greek literature by doing so, but it's not enough. You have to have people who love those texts. You have to have people who recognize their value and want to teach them and want to pass that down to the future. And that's what we need to do now. People are living now in incredible ignorance of the Western tradition, stuff that my parents and my grandparents took for granted. This is taught to every person who went to school. I recently had the occasion to study what was taught in the history department at Harvard in 1910. So they had a year of what they called ancient history, a year of what they called European history, and then they had U.S. history. They didn't call it Western history. They called it Greek and Roman, European, and American. So there are a lot of people wandering around, as you probably know, who say there is no such thing as Western history. It was invented in the 20th century. It's a Cold War category. It's simply not true. We have always studied the history of our civilization, and we've stopped doing it in the last 30 years, and we need to start doing it again. And that's why I wrote that book.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hankins. Thanks for that inspired story of how that book came to be. I think you make a very compelling case. Can we get a round of applause for our panel? They've given us such great insights tonight.